So today we're going to go over endocrine system. So we'll be learning about each endocrine gland, which hormones they produce, and a bit of what the actual hormone does. A bit more than the others. So at the very top, we have to first learn all the endocrine glands and what hormones they produce and general function of what those hormones do. Now, each hormone does do one thing and it also does other supplementary things. So what I want you to pay attention to, what's its major function of each hormone. So the endocrine system is a collection of glands of an organism that secrete hormones directly into the circulatory system to be carried towards distant target organs. Most of the time it's distant target organs, sometimes they're close by. For example, like the pancreas itself, right? It's producing insulin that drops into the duodenum that automatically in the jejunum starts absorbing sugar. So most of the time hormones are long distance. So why does this matter? Understanding the endocrine system enables you to monitor and advise patients with diseases such as hypothyroidism and adrenal insufficiency. Endocrinology is a study of hormones and endocrine glands. So just want you to know, make a note of that, endocrinology. 1 of every 11 people in the U.S. has diabetes. So again, that's a very, one of the most common endocrine dysfunctions that happens. And that is, one of the major reasons is your pancreas is not producing insulin. Either it's not producing enough insulin or no insulin whatsoever. So prediabetes means your blood glucose, also called blood sugar levels, are higher than normal. When your blood glucose levels reach a certain level, you have diabetes. What does that mean, prediabetes? If you ever heard somebody say that, there's a certain threshold of glucose that you should have in your bloodstream. So if you have too much glucose in your bloodstream, means that you're not producing enough insulin. So right away you'll know you're not producing enough insulin to absorb that. So there's a problem right there. So again, that's why it's important to know what is it that a hormone does, there where you know what's the function of it. Okay? So what is a hormone? So a hormone is a chemical release by one of the effect cells in our body by speeding up or slowing down bodily processes. So hormones dictate all your metabolism, your heart function, everything is dictated by endocrine system. So it tells tissues to divide, to replicate. There's amino acid derived, peptide hormones, and lipid derived or steroids. So your hormones control everything, right? Growth hormone, for example, is telling your cells to divide, right? To replicate, to divide constantly. So that's a slow drip when it comes to growth hormone itself. So there's 3 major types: amino acid, peptide, and lipid derived. What do hormones do? They control mostly all your bodily functions. So there's peptide hormones. So these bind to the outside. For example, insulin is a peptide hormone. Insulin is produced by your pancreas, and what it allows, your insulin, as you can see this key here, it opens up your cells, or it allows glucose to be absorbed to end up being produced into ATP. So that's an example of a peptide hormone. Then an amino acid, so remember peptides are technically, so amino acids are a bunch of peptides are a bunch of amino acids strung together. So there's peptide or polypeptide hormones, then there's amino acid. So they also bind to the outside of a receptor. Most lipid soluble bind to receptors and surface of target cell. Example of this is epinephrine. You know this is an amino acid because it has IN or INE. So we all know, we talked already about the sympathetic nervous system. So epinephrine or norepinephrine is an amino acid derived hormone. Then we have steroids. As you can see, these all act different. So you have your polypeptide that bind to the outside of your cell, then cause the actual action to happen. Steroids themselves actually go straight through the membrane and have an internal receptor. An example of a steroid hormone is a testosterone, and that's a major driver of male male features that we have. So make sure you know what a peptide, amino acid, and a steroid hormone do. So both of these, the peptide and the amino acid, bind to a receptor in the outside. The only difference here is any type of steroid hormone or lipid derived will go straight through the phospholipid membrane. Action of hormones. Through the hormones circulate systemically. That means everywhere. Only cells with the receptors for that hormone are affected. There's going to be target cells. There's always a target cell or target tissue. In order for the action to happen on those cells, they must have that specific cell. Going back to insulin. You could be producing, in your pancreas, you could be producing insulin, but the cells that are in your GI tract that need to absorb that glucose, they don't have the right receptor. So you may also be producing insulin normally, but you don't have the receptor to tell the cells that need to absorb glucose into your system do not have the correct receptor. So it doesn't always necessarily mean that you're not producing that hormone. Receptors are very important. So again, through hormones circulate systemically, only cells with receptors for that hormone are affected. It's just like a very example here. You can have cells that only have this. So only target cell for hormone A, this will only bind to this, and then it'll enact some type of action. This one in the middle has receptors for both A and B hormone itself. So again, receptors are very important. In order for hormones to work, the tissue or the cells has to have the receptor to bind to the specific hormone. Endocrine system acts with the nervous system to coordinate and integrate activity of body cells. So they're synonymous, and when we talk about the hypothalamus, you'll see. Don't forget the hypothalamus plays a huge influence on the endocrine system. So influences metabolic activities via hormones transported in the blood. Responses are slower but longer lasting than nervous system responses. Remember when I talked about the difference between neurotransmitters and hormones? This is where, if you remember, longer lasting. So hormones are usually longer lasting. The exception to the rule would be epinephrine. That is very, very quick. So endocrine system controls and integrates, kind of like the central nervous system. It controls reproduction. That's a major one. It controls growth and development. Yeah, you go from young to puberty and so forth. Reproduction is the big one, and all your metabolism. That's the major three things it does: reproduction, growth and development, and metabolism. That's what your endocrine system and a bird's eye view does. So it controls and integrates that. Endocrine glands, exocrine glands. We've already talked about these. Remember, I had you go ahead and in the test, I wanted you to learn this. So endocrine glands, exocrine glands. Most of your endocrine system is going to use endocrine glands. Remember, endocrine glands, they secrete substances directly into the capillaries. So you have this bundle of cells here that produce some type of hormone. They get stimulus from another hormone. Most of the time the anterior pituitary gland comes here, binds to these receptors, a specific hormone, tells these cells to produce their own hormone that secretes into capillaries, and that goes systemically. Exocrine glands, the endocrine system doesn't have many exocrine glands, but it does have a few. The one that does have both, which is a mixed gland, is your pancreas. So again, we already reviewed this. Make sure you know what's an endocrine gland, exocrine gland. The endocrine system, which makes sense, has mostly endocrine glands, which means that they're surrounded by capillaries, and they essentially diffuse their hormone inside the capillaries, and then that spreads systemically. Exocrine glands, remember, secrete their products into ducts. The exception to the rule here, your pancreas. Your pancreas is a digestive organ, and it's also an endocrine gland. It's a mixed gland. So the two major hormones that we're interested in here for the endocrine system is glucagon and insulin. So as you can see, it is dumped into the duodenum right in here. So we're going to start by looking at all the endocrine glands. The pineal gland, hypothalamus also plays a huge role. The pituitary gland, thyroid gland, parathyroid in the back. We have your adrenal glands, your pancreas, and your gonads. You're either male or female. So hormone action on target cells may either be after the plasma membrane permeability and other membrane potential, opening and closing of ion channels. That's what they'll do. They stimulate synthesis of enzymes or other proteins. Activate or deactivate enzymes, induce secretion activity, stimulate mitosis. So these are just the basic stuff that hormones will tell what to do to tissue or cells. So hormone action on target cells may be either of these: opening and closing of ion channels, enzymes and proteins, activate and deactivate enzymes, induce secretion activity, or stimulate mitosis. Again, that is division. Or they will also stimulate that cell to do what it does. Other tissues and organs that produce hormones. Adipose tissue. More than likely, adipose tissue will be elevated soon, potential in the next decade, to an endocrine gland. Thymus. Thymus is technically where your T cells go to mature. That also produces hormones. We also have small intestine and stomach also produce hormones. Kidneys and heart as well produce hormones. So we're going to start at the very, very, very top. If you remember some central nervous system, the hypothalamus, it has a lot of endocrine functions. So the pituitary gland produces releasing and inhibiting hormones which stop and start the production of other hormones throughout the body. So at the very, very top, we have the hypothalamus, which gets its commands from the actual brain itself. So the hypothalamus is an endocrine gland. The hypothalamus does other things as well. If you remember me talking about feeding behavior, it responds to leptin and all those. So hypothalamus has a lot of different functions, but it also really it's a major player in the endocrine system. So let's take a look at that. Okay, so look at this. As you can see, it responds to leptin, to ghrelin, appetite. It also promotes a lot of other things, galactose to be produced, reproduction as well. Okay, so your hypothalamus at the very top, what this does is it controls homeostasis. It keeps everything in balance. So that's your major role of your hypothalamus, to keep everything in homeostasis. How does that do that? It commands your endocrine system. The connector between endocrine and nervous system, also the hypothalamus. So the hypothalamus here, first and foremost, when we look at this picture here, so we have these cells. These are neurocircuitry cells. So the posterior pituitary gland is technically not glandular tissue. The anterior one is technically glandular tissue, as you can see right here. So the hypothalamus, all this does, it either starts or inhibits, or it turns on or turns off the anterior pituitary gland. And then the anterior pituitary gland releases its own hormones, and then there's a systemic target organ. But the posterior, as you can see right here, it has these little these specialized nervous tissue cells, right? The posterior pituitary gland is actually not glandular tissue at all. It's actually nervous tissue instead. It's a mixture. A neurocircuitry cell is a neuron that responds to action potentials, but then it also releases hormones at the other end. It's a very distinct, very niche cell. So as you can see, these neuroendocrine cells receive synaptic signals from other neurons and produce action potentials. So this neuron, action potentials, right, ligand gated, then this neuroendocrine or neurocircuitry cell ends up producing the actual hormone, as then it's released into these capillaries right in here. So the key feature here to the hypothalamus is it commands the anterior pituitary gland specifically, but it also kind of has its arms stretched out, and these are specialized neurocircuitry cells that they themselves are stimulated by action potentials that end up producing specifically hormones, which is oxytocin and ADH. And these affect uterine muscles, mammary glands, and kidney tubules. So that is the major thing. And then the master gland, that is essentially called in layman's terms, is the anterior pituitary gland. So as you can see this, so first, this is your nose. I like this picture right here. Nose is facing forward. The front part here is the anterior pituitary gland. That is glandular tissue. That's endocrine tissue. The posterior, as you can see nervous tissue, these are neurons. But these neurons at the very top here send action potentials to these neurocircuitry cells, and then they release their two hormones. But there's a posterior gland and the anterior gland as well. So this together is your pituitary gland, which is in two major parts. Just know that the posterior one is actually technically a mixture of glandular and nervous tissue. The anterior is only endocrine tissue or glandular tissue, and they release their hormones into the bloodstream as well. Okay, so see at the very top, you have the hypothalamus. Then you have all the hormones that the hypothalamus releases, except, right, this is to do with the pituitary gland. You have the anterior and the posterior. So remember, the posterior, or the back part of the pituitary gland, this is technically directly neurocircuitry cells that go directly to their target organ. The hypothalamus, the anterior part, or you can always think anterior where your nose is at, that front part, that needs to get stimulated by the hypothalamus, and then that releases its own specific hormone. Then that goes to the target organ, and then these are a few different target organs that we have here. So the posterior is essentially, I always think of like a hypothalamus has direct hands directly into the capillary beds to release oxytocin and ADH. So make sure you know this difference. Okay, so the pituitary gland is split into two, anterior, posterior. What's the major difference between both of these? The posterior is it has these specialized cells that I just talked about. The anterior is all glandular tissue. They need to be stimulated specifically by the hypothalamus. Then the anterior lobe produces its own hormone to enact action to specific organs or target tissues. So now let's take a look, right? So the pituitary gland, its major function, two lobes. So we already know what the hypothalamus is and what it does. Then we have the master gland. Here we have the pituitary gland split into two major parts. Remember again, highlighting, posterior is technically nervous mixed tissue. The anterior is mostly glandular tissue. So the pituitary gland takes messages from the brain via the hypothalamus. So the brain commands the actual hypothalamus there, okay, and uses these messages to produce hormones that affect many parts of the body, including stimulating all other hormone production glands to produce their own hormones. So the posterior or the pituitary gland gets stimulus from hormones. It produces its own hormones to go off to endocrine glands to produce their own hormones. So it's literally hormones on top of hormones that are stimulating finally to get to the specific target organs that produce potentially sometimes either an action or another different type of hormone itself. So then again, let's look at this. So we have your posterior gland here, the posterior and the anterior pituitary gland. So again, as you can see, this picture, this might make a bit more sense. Direct release. This is your posterior. Hypothalamus releases corticotropin, thyrotropin, growth hormone inhibiting hormone, prolactin, gonadotropin. So these are hormones that are produced by the hypothalamus to enact or stimulate the anterior pituitary gland. So we'll start on this end here. So we have adrenocorticotropic hormone that's released by your anterior gland. That enacts change onto the adrenal cortex. So that stimulates. So I want you to know this. Adrenocorticotropic hormone that's released by your anterior pituitary gland stimulates the adrenal glands. Then we have TSH, thyroid stimulating hormone. That's a nice easy one. It makes sense. That stimulates your thyroid gland to produce T3 and T4, calcitonin as well. Then we have growth hormone. That's an easy one. Growth hormone it's a vast hormone. In this case, it's stimulating the liver to produce other hormones to actually enact growth. In this case, it's giving you bone and muscle tissue for it to divide. Then we have prolactin. That's specific to mammary glands. Then we have the major ones that are associated with reproduction, which are follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. So both of these, follicle and luteinizing hormone, as you can see, they're crossing on over. They both stimulate. So follicle stimulating and luteinizing hormone both stimulate male testes, as well as the follicle stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone, stimulate female ovaries. Then we have, which I've already talked about, melanocyte stimulating hormone that specifically enacts melanocytes to produce melanin. And we talked about that when we talked about integumentary system. Then we have, now this is the next, right? Now we jump onto the posterior, right? This is direct release. So as you can see, there's no hormones on top of here dictating what is released. So the anterior needs to be stimulated by the hypothalamus, and then it releases its own hormone, then the actual target organ or target tissue. In this case, the posterior, direct release into your capillaries. And that's where you have oxytocin and adrenodiuretic hormone or vasopressin that enact on male smooth muscle and female uterine smooth muscle, and kidneys specifically, antidiuretic hormone or vasopressin that either tells your kidneys to release or hold on to liquid. So this is your anterior and your posterior pituitary gland. I want you to know what all of these do and which target tissue or target organs they're going after. Then we go to we moving on down. So now we went from the hypothalamus, then the pituitary gland, which is split into the anterior and the posterior, and then we have the pineal gland. This one is nice and easy. Secretes melatonin. We already talked about this in if you remember, it enacts a suprachiasmatic nucleus, which is in charge of your sleep and wake cycles. So that is pretty much it. Your pineal gland, it has been researched furthermore. We're going to probably more than likely discover it does other things as well. But as far as science is concerned right now, your pineal gland is in charge of sleep and wake cycles. So it secretes melatonin. What does melatonin do? It enacts your sleep and wake cycles. Melatonin is released and you start to fall asleep. What is it that wakes up and stops the production of that? As we talked about, blue light. Okay, so you have right in here suprachiasmatic nucleus, right? It interacts, and then you have your pineal gland as well. So your pineal gland enacts a suprachiasmatic nucleus, which is in charge of your sleep and wake cycles. Then we have moving on down. Now we're at moving on down. Now we have thyroid hormone. So again, hypothalamus, it never goes away. Hypothalamus stimulates the what's it called, the anterior pituitary gland by releasing thyroid releasing hormone. That enacts the anterior pituitary gland to release thyroid stimulating hormone. So again, as hypothalamus releases its own hormone to stimulate, to tell, hey, anterior pituitary gland, release thyroid stimulating hormone. Now finally, this thyroid stimulating hormone goes off to your thyroid gland. Then we produce T3 and T4, triiodothyronine hormone and thyroxine hormone, right in here. So what do those? Thyroxine, main hormone secreted into the bloodstream by the thyroid gland. This is a prohormone. It still needs to go off and travel to it has a pit stop. So your T4, thyroxine needs to head off. Once it's released by your thyroid gland, needs to go off to your liver and your kidneys to be turned into triiodothyronine, and that is the one that's in charge of growth and development, metabolism, body temperature, and heart rate. So when the doctor checks, the really one that they're checking is the T4. Because if you're not producing any T4, we already know that this T4 thyroxine has to go off to your liver and your kidneys and then change into triiodothyronine, so T3, which is in charge of your metabolism. So that's why they always check most of your T4. How much T4 are you producing? If you know how much T4 you're producing, you know more than likely how much T3 you're producing. So that's just a side note. Remember, T4 thyroxine, that is the major one that's produced by your thyroid gland. That needs to have a pit stop, head over to your liver, your kidneys, then it's turned into triiodothyronine, or T3. T3 is a major driver of your metabolism, temperature, heart rate, growth, and development. Then we flip it backwards. We have the parathyroid glands. Don't forget this. It's very easy to forget. Parathyroid hormone raises blood calcium levels by, this is a great picture. It shows right here. So now I release parathyroid hormone in the very back. There's 4 little nodules here. That releases it into your bloodstream. It goes systemically. And what does it tell your bones to do? It activates osteoclast, calcium, and phosphate ions released into your blood. So it breaks down your bone and releases calcium into your bloodstream. It also tells, second down the line here, to increase calcium absorption from food. So it tells your duodenum, which most of your digestion takes place, to keep and absorb calcium. This is, again, PTH, or parathyroid hormone. It also tells your kidneys to promote activation of vitamin D, and that enacts increased calcium absorption, as you can see this arrow, and it also increases calcium reabsorption. So what happens here is your kidneys, remember, it's a filter mechanism. It's also a release mechanism. So PTH, parathyroid hormone, is telling your kidneys, hey, hold on to that calcium. As calcium levels rise, calcium does the opposite effect to your parathyroid hormone. So as you can see this picture, calcium is rising in the bloodstream. So calcium itself it binds to the parathyroid hormone glands and tells it, hey, we have enough calcium, we're good, stop. So this cycle has a negative and positive effect on itself. Okay? So parathyroid raises the blood calcium level by, and this picture tells you exactly what's happening. Then we have adrenal glands. We talked a bit about a specific part of the adrenal glands, the adrenal medulla, right? The fight or flight mechanism that we talked about. So there's 2 major parts to your adrenal gland, the cortex and the medulla. So the outside and the middle. So the adrenal gland produces hormones involved in electrolyte balance and stress response. That's the major function. So we have, let's go and look over here first, right? Short term. So the adrenal medulla, which produces epinephrine and norepinephrine, we should already still know this. Remember, short-term stress response. This is sympathetic nervous system, the fight or flight. And we already talked about this, what we talked about, remember, in class, glycogen, increased blood pressure, increased breathing. Remember your arteries, they constrict, therefore enacting a bunch of changes. Your pupils dilate. So all this is epinephrine and norepinephrine. That is a hormone. It's stimulated by the central nervous system, as we talked about before in class. Then we have the adrenal cortex, which is the outside. and that is enacted by ACTH, adrenal. And these two, the adrenal cortex itself, produces mineralocorticoids and glucocorticoids. So these two are long-term stress responses. So mineral, retention of sodium, which makes sense, right? Corticoids, retention of sodium ions and water by kidneys, increased blood volume and blood pressure. So mineral corticoids are produced by your adrenal cortex. Those are dumped into your bloodstream. Glucocorticoids, protein and fats break down and convert to glucose, leading to increased blood glucose. Immune system may be suppressed. So both of these are long-term stress responses, and they're produced by your adrenal cortex itself. Your adrenal medulla, epinephrine, norepinephrine. And as you can see, it's always connected right up to your hypothalamus. Then we have your pancreas. Pancreas right in here. It produces a lot of digestive enzymes. This is a mixed gland. It's associated with your digestive system, but it's also an endocrine gland. So the two major hormones that I want you to know that the pancreas, so first, know that the pancreas has endocrine glands and exocrine glands. That's a key feature. The next thing, it's involved in homeostasis, specifically for glucose. As you can see, as you can see number 1 here, what happens? I have a bunch of glucose in my bloodstream. Well, I need to release insulin. As insulin is released, that insulin itself shuts down the production of insulin. So there you go. I already absorbed all that glucose into my cells and so forth. I'm good. Well, what happens when the levels drop? Well, my pancreas itself also will produce glucagon. Glucagon tells specifically my liver to break down glycogen into glucose, to release it into my bloodstream. So that's what my pancreas does as an endocrine gland. So it produces insulin and glucagon. As glucagon goes off to your liver and it tells it, hey, break down glycogen into glucose, that's dropped into my bloodstream. For extra energy, well, I have plenty of glucose. Well, I need to enact and tell insulin, hey, start producing it, and that's my pancreas. So the major hormones that are produced here are insulin, for our sake, insulin and glucagon, and that's in your pancreas. Then we have ovaries. So we have estrogen, progesterone. This is follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. So remember, both of these enact change into both male and female gonads. So estrogen, that's stimulated both by luteinizing hormone, is an instrumental in breast development, fat distribution in the hips, legs, breast, and development of reproductive organs. Granulosa cells are the ones, granulosa cells are the ones that produce estrogen. Then estrogen ends up being used for female reproduction. Progesterone, or P4, involved in the menstrual cycle, pregnancy, and embryogenesis of humans and other species. This is produced in the corpus luteum. So this is where the actual female egg is produced during menstrual cycles. So you have estrogen, progesterone. Who enacts those? Luteinizing hormone. As you guys remember, if we come all the way back up here, the hypothalamus, homeostasis, and I start talking about the anterior pituitary gland, right? Prolactin, here it is. There it is. So follicle stimulating hormone, right in here, and luteinizing hormone. Both of these stimulate male, and both of these stimulate female. So luteinizing and follicle stimulating hormone, the change that happens here in female reproductive organs or gonads, estrogen and progesterone. Who produces, right, luteinizing and follicle stimulating hormone? The one that produces estrogen are granulosa cells, and corpus luteum is where the menstrual cycle happens. So that's progesterone. Then we have males. The major one that's produced here, the major hormone, is testosterone. These are testosterone is produced in Leydig cells. This little cells right in here. So these little cells right here are the ones producing testosterone. Testosterone is responsible for many of the physical characteristics specific to adult males, and it plays a key role in reproduction and maintenance of bone and muscle strength. Now, both males obviously produce much more testosterone, but they also have estrogen as well. It's the same for females too. They will also produce testosterone. They just produce it at much lower levels than men do. So in this case, I want you to know that both luteinizing and follicle stimulating hormone stimulate both the male and female reproductive organs or gonads. These granulosa cells are the ones that actually end up producing estrogen because they're stimulated by the anterior pituitary gland. Corpus luteum produces progesterone that acts upon the female reproduction or menstrual cycle right in here to produce, and in AMP2 you guys will talk about this, the corpus luteum, that's where the egg is produced. For males, again, also follicle stimulating and luteinizing hormone enact changes in the actual male gonads. The male gonads, specifically the Leydig cells, is what produces testosterone. So as you can see right in here, the hypothalamus at the very top again. So testosterone, right? So as you can see, the pituitary gland produces luteinizing and follicle stimulating hormone. It has a positive effect on both of them. As estrogen and progesterone and testosterone being produced, depending if you're a male or female, they actually go up to the pituitary gland and tell it to stop. So in order for it to stop producing, the pituitary gland to stop producing luteinizing and follicle stimulating hormone, enough testosterone or estrogen and progesterone need to be produced to essentially tell the pituitary gland, okay, we've had enough. And then at the very top, you have the hypothalamus that produces its own hormone to have a positive effect on the anterior pituitary gland to tell it to produce luteinizing or follicle stimulating hormone. So it's always a big cycle. This pituitary gland is telling it to produce testosterone or estrogen, progesterone. As testosterone rises, testosterone comes back up and binds to the pituitary gland. A couple biochemical pathways happen, and it tells it, okay, we've had enough. Stop producing it. Okay? So, again, going back up to the top, make sure you know each gland. The hypothalamus plays a huge role in endocrine function. I want you to make sure you know each endocrine gland, what hormone does it produce, and the general function of that hormone. So, with that said, I will leave you, and this was a nice short introduction to endocrine system. Have a great day.